So, welcome everyone to second our second public event. And I just want to acknowledge that Carleton University is on the unceded land of the Algonquin people. And I also want to acknowledge my deep ambivalence about land acknowledgements, that they remind us of a colonial history of dispossession and destruction. And it's always good to be reminded of our embeddedness in structures and systems of power and privilege and disenfranchisement, but a land acknowledgement is inadequate to the task of repair or transformation of those structures. And so at best, through that reminder, it asks us what we see as possible in this particular historical moment in which we find ourselves to work towards repair and transformation. I also want to acknowledge all the people who have made this possible: the Department of Political Science, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, the Institute of Political Economy, the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Program, and the Faculty of Public Affairs at Carleton University, as well as the Social Science and Humanities Research Council through a connection grant, all made this event possible. There were also lots of people who are not very visible, the people who have done the catering services, and those in the back of the room making this happen so smoothly, and Ruchi Shrivasti, who's helped with the arrangements, and the event staff. So thanks to you also for being here on a cold and snowy evening, and for whatever contributions you feel moved to make during this event. So, one person who is thinking deeply through these issues of transformation of systems of privilege and dispossession, focused on domestic work, is Dr. Jean-François Meyer, Associate Professor of Political Science in Concordia University. More broadly, he's looked at civil society organizations, social movements, and labor politics in Latin America. He's written on chronic violence in workplaces in Brazil and labor movements in Mexico, publishing with others an edited volume on laboring in Latin America, democracy and worker organization in the neoliberal era from the University of Florida Press. He's a member of the Network of Research on Household Work in Latin America, or VITAL, and most recently he's been collaborating with the Union of Domestic Workers in the city of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and he's going to share some of that exciting research with us in a talk titled Caring for Care Workers, Domestic Workers Organizations and Resistance in Times of Crisis. So we're really glad to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katty. Hi, all. Good evening. Well, good afternoon. It's not evening yet, although it does feel like it given the time change. So first of all, my heartfelt thanks to Katty and Prof. Alana for the invitation, to Maria Liz for recommending me, and to allow me to speak to you all on this subject that's very dear to my heart. It is a real pleasure to be present among you today as part of this wonderful and I think timely event that you've organized. And it's always a privilege to be able to talk about the struggles and accomplishments of domestic workers. And this talk, this presentation is about, in fact, and is going to be in spirit with the women of the Union of Domestic Workers of the municipality of Sao Paulo, which I'm going to call the union or the sindicato kind of from now on. And I have a long-standing working relationship with these women, but also, and perhaps equally importantly, a long-standing relation of friendship with them. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. What this talk really is about it deals with the changing forms of resistance that were used by the union, by the sindicato activists. It's about their resilience, and I think mostly it's about their capacity to care for domestic workers during exceptionally difficult times. Okay, and this is the time of the COVID-19 crisis. All right, so where this research came from, or this part of my research came from, was very simply during the COVID pandemic, at the start of it all, when we were all kind of seemingly running around disoriented, wondering what was happening. I was, of course, um, worried about my friends in the Union of Domestic Workers in São Paulo. I was wondering how they were doing, how domestic workers in São Paulo were faring in general, in the context of this very abrupt, in fact, public health and economic crisis that emerged as a result of the COVID-19. And that started me thinking along the lines of a more general research question, which was something like, how do marginalized people, CSOs or civil society organizations, how do they adjust in context of sudden crises? Okay, and in particular, how do these crises impact the structures and organization of civil society organizations? And I realized relatively quickly that in the academic literature, this question was not particularly well answered. Okay, so civil society organizations, CSOs, very briefly, they're generally understood as this private or voluntary association, that's a type of association that's created autonomously from the state, and which exists between the state and the citizens for the purpose of representing the interests of the citizenry, right? And in the literature, CSOs are generally divided in two groups. Okay, so you have civil society organizations that are devoted to advocacy and mobilizations, and others that are devoted to solidarity and care provision. Okay, and in fact, what's interesting, one of the things that's interesting about the literature is that there seems to be this expectation that once a CSO has emerged as one particular type of organization, either advocacy or service and care provision or solidarity provision, there is very few possibilities of the CSO moving over to the other type or hybridizing, incorporating traits of the other category of CSO. And if that were to happen, there are a few studies on this. Generally, the expectation is the organization that will try to hybridize or change its kind of structure, organization, perhaps even identity, the organization will crumble, will disintegrate and crumble. Okay, and so that was part of the literature. That was the kind of the first element of trying to answer this question of, okay, what's going on in Brazil during the COVID crisis in response to the economic and public health very sudden emergency situations that emerged. So that was the first part of the answer. Was kind of, it was very incomplete. Then I dug a little bit deeper and looked at the impact of crisis on CSOs. So first of all, what the scholarship generally talks about is what CSOs do in context of crisis already. So the crisis has started. How do CSOs act or behave? And the focus is generally on care provision and service CSOs. There's very little on advocacy CSOs. And in fact, there's even less on how do these organizations react to sudden crises. Okay, there's very little, despite the fact that there's been several cases of sudden economic and public health crises over the past kind of at least 10 to 15 years. And that's even more true for advocacy organizations. Okay, so then I had a bit of a puzzle, which led to my research goal, which was to find out how advocacy-focused organizations of marginalized people adjust to sudden economic and public healthcare crises. So that's kind of the departure point, and so I focused my research on the lived experiences of the women, because they were overwhelmingly women, of the women of the Union of Domestic Workers of the municipality of Sao Paulo in Brazil during the COVID crisis of 2020 to 2022, roughly. Okay. And my argument for this research is that that crisis represented a bit of a critical juncture for the sindicato, for the union, which prompted organizational and functional changes. Okay. And very quickly, my findings tended to support that, but they tended to support that by showing an adaptation to the crisis by diversifying and broadening the offer of resistance strategies on the part of the union, right? In particular, in the direction of care provision and solidarity, and a specific type of care provision that I'm going to talk about a little bit later on, which is going to be psychological support. Okay, so it went beyond the provision of, in particular, goods material help, which was something that had been seen in other countries of Latin America, of course, within Brazil as well. But in this particular case, the women of the sindicato designed purposefully a strategy to bring psychological support to domestic workers, not only their members, but domestic workers broadly in Sao Paulo, in the city of Sao Paulo. I encourage you, by the way, to stop me, ask me questions. If there are things that are not clear during the presentation, I tend to get over enthusiastic and get carried away. So if that's the case, sometimes I kind of go over some things very quickly. So please don't hesitate to intervene. I love being able to engage in questions and answered. So this is a very kind of schematic portrait of remunerated domestic labor in Brazil. I was just saying to Maria Alice at the break that I call it domestic labor because, and domestic work, because my friends and partners of the Union of Sao Paulo call it domestic work as well. They don't really call it household work. So although they absolutely understand and respect that terminology, I'm going to stick to this one here in the presentation. Okay, so this is a portrait of domestic work in Brazil, remunerated domestic labor. So around the time of the pandemic, the numbers now are probably a little bit different, but that gives us an idea. So there were roughly 6.5 million domestic workers in Brazil. That represents about 6.5% of the country's labor force. So that's about 110 million people, 43% of which are women. 94%, 95% of domestic workers are women, and at least 65% are Afro-descendant, okay? Domestic work represents the largest source of employment for women in Brazil, specifically for Afro-Brazilian women. It's about 15%, okay? And there's more than 72% of them who labor informally. So that means without a signed contract. Or in Brazil, something that's perhaps as, if not more usual, is a sign, they call it working card, okay, which is a kind of a booklet where the employers kind of fill in a little bit of the details of the work. Okay, so 72% at least work without this document or a labor contract. At least, and that stat I'm thinking is probably out of date, but at least 35% of them are daily workers, so they're day laborers, what are called diaristas in Brazil, and that number for sure is wrong, but officially 1.3% of them are live-ins, so they live at their employer's house. But we have a very, very strong feeling that that's an underrepresentation of what's happening, especially in areas such as the countryside, where kind of self-declaration of domestic workers is very low, and conditions, et cetera, et cetera. This was an aging labor force before the COVID. So whereas there's this idea, this tradition of having a younger kind of woman coming and working for the family and doing domestic work, at the time of the COVID, we were getting close to about 50% of that labor force that was not old by any stretch of the imagination, but that was above 46, 47 years old. So it was getting, and that the curve was clear that it was getting to be an older labor category. But now we have kind of preliminary evidence that with the COVID, that's actually the country that's happened. So a lot of domestic workers in Brazil now are much younger. They enter the labor force at a younger age because of lack of opportunities as a result of the COVID pandemic. Okay. In Brazil, also, a lot of the domestic workers are often either internal migrants or directly their mothers and their parents were internal migrants, but increasingly you find external migrants, especially workers from Bolivia. Okay, that are increasingly represented also as that kind of labor force. The monthly salary of domestic workers is on average lower than the national minimum wage, the legally established minimum wage. To give you an idea, I'm going to use current terms. The current minimum salary in Brazil is about 1,300 reais per month. That works out to $352 Canadian per month. And so a domestic worker would be paid about 800 reais per month. Okay, so about you'd call it about $175, 180, getting close to 200. When you know that the basic food basket in Brazil costs 770 reais a month. Okay, Brandon. Okay, to the question, yeah.
Oh, sorry, for
Thank
the
you.
folks online.
Yes.
So my question is, so the wage is super low.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes what's making up the I'm curious what's making up the difference and if it's engaging in kind of regularized forms of credit.
Yes, that's a very good question. In general, we have evidence. Okay, so two parts. In the cities, that doesn't seem to be the case. In the countryside, we have evidence that that might be the case, in fact. In the cities, what ended up happening is that there's diversification of strategies of survival. And also what this average is this representation. It's a compounded measure. And so as you're younger, your salary tends to be oftentimes more modest. The employer will take advantage of your age, right? And so even though the law prohibits it, domestic workers start very often working at a very young age. So the popular imaginary is 12, 13 years old, but we have very strong evidence that especially in the countryside, they will start as young as 5 or 6 years old and will be paid nothing at that point. 12, 13 years old will be paid a tiny little bit, and then you go up. As you get older, you can negotiate oftentimes better salaries for yourself because of experience and because of a more extensive network of support, including in some cases unions, although the last entry there shows that unionization rate of domestic workers in Brazil is very low. It's about 2%, right? So that's thanks for the question. So that's a little bit of a basic portrait of domestic work in Brazil. So now the data behind this research results from fairly extensive field work that I've done, research that I've carried out since 2017 in São Paulo, which is the megalopolis of Brazil and one of the largest cities of Latin America. And the method that I use relies on, it combines ethnography with participatory action research. And so I closely collaborate with the directors. They're called the directors, the leaders, the activists of the union of domestic workers of Sao Paulo, and several of the members of the union, but also non-unionized domestic workers in Sao Paulo. I've been fortunate to take part in many of the Sindicatos activities, including recruitment, network, and community building efforts, information diffusion campaigns, daily activities also ranging from acting as a doorman of their building. They have a small building all the way to helping with computers and banner making. They were gifted a little house by a former employer of a domestic worker who, as part, I believe, of her will, decided to give the union this little house that was very nicely transformed into a place with several offices, and we'll have some pictures later on, and that's where the union does a lot of I think we can rightfully call its magic. I've also worked in collaboration with the Sindicato in co-producing 3 research projects that have been funded by external funding agencies, and all the research projects are really designed to promote the empowerment of domestic workers in Sao Paulo. And they're typically designed in the following way, which is that the union tells me what they want to do, and we try to figure out ways to kind of make it happen together. And that means really kind of co-developing, co-imagining, co-creating these projects. And the latest one that we have, which I wanted to talk about, but I don't think I'm going to have time, was the research was conducted by 15 of the members of the union, domestic workers, who interviewed close to 300 other domestic workers in trying to find out more about the day-to-day reality of this category of work, their work-life challenges, as well as their hopes and dreams. So that's been carried out. We have the preliminary results, and we're going to engage in another wave, which we're hoping is going to reach about 1,000 participants. So as a result of that, I've carried dozens and dozens of conversations with, carried out those conversations with the union's directors and several of their members, as well as non-members, mainly in the form of open-ended discussions. And in classic kind of ethnographic fashion, I just, go back. So the data collection occurs through repeated conversations and interactions, and that is not something that is trivial, because we went from a situation where at the very beginning of my work with the union and the directors, they were asking me, why do you care? Why do you care about domestic workers? Why do you care about our work? Why is that of interest to you and to academia or the broader world? And there was, of course, the question of establishing trust, which is not a given when you have, an outsider who comes in, a white middle-aged man, a gringo with a funny accent, and the question was, why do you care? And I think we build up a strong relationship. But first of all, they wanted to know about that because they've had several bad experiences in the past with in particular academics, but also other categories of researchers. But eventually, a few years later, actually, it was last year, I asked them and I said, so now let me reverse the table and ask you, why do you put up with me? Because I'm back here all the time, and I come and I hang out with you, and I just stay sometimes in a corner. And they said, it's easy. They said, because you come back. Because you come back because you look us in the eye. And you shake our hand. And you give us hugs when it's time to give a hug. And they say, so many people don't want to touch us. So many people don't look at us in the eyes. And they said, so, basically, you come back. And I think that was a really kind of, to me, very touching demonstration of how the trust was built and over time. But also was a reflection of how that trust had been before betrayed in other occasions. So it's really thanks to them that of course we got access to this data very quickly, and then we'll get to some of the findings. The union itself, I've talked about it several times. It's one of the, I would say, leading domestic workers organizations in Brazil. It's comprised of the numbers are evolving, 4,000 to 5,000 members. And the union is routinely in touch through the wonders of WhatsApp, anywhere between 600 to 800 of them, which is quite a lot. The executive, the director's board, the diretoria, is comprised of 12 to 15 members. All of them are women and volunteers, okay? And most of them are in some ways, they're either going to be retired, semi-retired, or they're not retired at all, and therefore they have to find a way to generate income while they devote a lot of their time to the union, right? Which again is not something that is atypical for unions of domestic workers, but in this case, as it's closer to what I do, then I aside firsthand that sometimes that implies very significant sacrifices. Okay. The STD-MSP was the first union of the country, the first domestic workers organization of Brazil to win a collective or a CCT for domestic workers in the city of São Paulo. That later became a model for collective agreements at the level of the state. And through the collective agreement, they get for domestic workers, and they get a higher minimum salary than what is guaranteed by the law. Okay, so if you're unionized, if you through that union, and if you can get and if you can get a copy of that collective agreement, you bring it to your patroa, to your employer. They sign it, and you're guaranteed working and conditions that are generally better, and a salary that's generally better than what's already guaranteed. This is particularly remarkable because it implied a negotiation with and an agreement with the Union of Domestic Workers Employers of São Paulo, which up until not too long had been really resistant to grant such a deal, but eventually it was reached. It was the first union also to incorporate a department of migrant and indigenous workers, it relies on a very kind of, I think, innovative recruitment strategy that we'll talk about a little bit later on. So the crisis of the COVID happens in a kind of a bit of a broader context in Brazil. Before we get to this slide, I just wanted to say that these pictures that I have, most of the pictures that you're seeing today are pictures of the women of the Union of Domestic Workers of São Paulo. They're taken by themselves or me, and so this actually is a picture of their latest General Assembly, which just occurred a couple of weeks ago. Okay, so now to a different type of image. So the broader context of the pandemic is the pandemic happened in an environment that had been that had become, politically speaking, significantly more conservative since 2016, since the what we'll call the institutional coup against democratically elected President Dilma Rousseff, which brought to power a conservative interim president, Michel Temer, succeeded by the far-right Jair Bolsonaro, who was in power between 2018 and 2022. This represents a period of protracted political crisis for Brazilian marginalized people, civil society organizations, and in particular with domestic workers, because they represented a symbolic target of the conservative and regressive, in fact, policies of these two successive governments, among other things because these women embody a lot of characteristics that would make them a likely target for marginalization for these governments. They are women, they are very often Black, and they come from a poor, disadvantaged background. Okay, and on top of that, they demand respect of their labor rights and human rights. All right. Okay, so what ends up happening, and for those of you who have not recognized him, this is Bolsonaro during a campaign period, and he's wielding an assault machine gun, because that's what you do, of course, during political campaigns. Apparently, either that or a chainsaw in Argentina right now. Apparently, that's what catches the eye. So during these governments, what you'll see are going to be, among other things, these three elements: legal changes. So there's going to be a change to the labor law in 2017. Again, domestic workers are going to be used as a symbol of the dismantling of the previous government's, leftist government's policy, the Workers' Party's policies. There's going to be an undoing of progressive measures that were embodied in a kind of a constitutional reform that was called the PEC das Domésticas, the constitutional amendment of the domestic workers. There's going to be a flexibilization of labor conditions, an end to what's called the union tax, which was money that was perceived on formal workers' salary, the equivalent of 1 day of salary during the year, that was then channeled through the state to the unions in Brazil, and that's what allowed the unions to actually, survive and get by. As of 2017, most of the unions in Brazil see that help being completely cut off, which results in the collapsing of a great number of them, not least of which domestic workers' unions. Okay, there's also a precarization of the daily workers' situation. And this is interesting because this is related to a question that was asked earlier during the roundtable about what happens to these different strategies to try to employ domestic workers through other means, in particular applications, or convincing, in fact, domestic workers that they can be self-employed or entrepreneurs. But as a matter of fact, the end result is a further degradation of working conditions and employment conditions for a lot of these workers. There's going to be also a closing or dilution of several mechanisms, institutional mechanisms of democratic inclusion, in particular the ministries of social development, sports, culture, environment, indigenous affairs, racial equality, et cetera, et cetera. And there's going to be an institutionalization of state and para-state repression of grassroots and marginalized people's movements. The Movimiento Negro, the Black people's movements, LGBTQ plus movements, the homeless people's movements, etc. How is it that domestic workers in Sao Paulo reacted to this general context before we go to the crisis of the COVID? First of all, they confronted this situation by this hostile political environment by deepening their advocacy activities. Okay, especially in the case of this particular union that we're talking about today. So there's a strong emphasis on what they call organização da base, which is organizing and empowering the base, the membership. Okay, so domestic workers. They're going to implement a strategy of rodas de conversa. So there are conversation groups. But what's interesting about this is that they're not conversation groups that are held kind of classically in some points, some specific predetermined points in the cities. They're conversation groups that are outreach strategies. Okay, to raise awareness among domestic workers by meeting them in the very often marginalized peripheral urban areas where they live. Okay, so the directors of the union will go and they will travel to the communities, to what people often refer to as the favelas, where a lot of these domestic workers live, and they will meet with them on the Sunday, which is the day of rest for most domestic workers. On the Sunday, they will have some of these pictures here. You see these pictures are at gatherings in popular centers, sometimes in a person's house. The lower picture there is at a person's house. They were just invited, the union directors or some of them, and there's a presentation that's being done about very basic presentation about as a domestic workers, you have rights. First of all, you have rights. And these are the rights that you have. And then there's a presentation. And then this is how the union can help you claim these rights, right? They also, the union offer clinics on again, labor rights. They teach classes on calculation of benefits. A lot of domestic workers have a very tough time, very difficult times figuring out how benefits can be calculated. This part might be made obsolete because there was an app recently launched in Brazil that makes calculation a lot easier. The challenge now is, of course, people actually using it and the app being functional, meaning not crashing. There was a previous version launched, I think about 3.5 years ago, that was very problematic. It couldn't really be readily used. So we're hoping that this time it'll be useful. And there was a continuation of the union's work of registering domestic workers and promoting the collective agreement of the city of Sao Paulo. But with oh yeah, and this is a picture of one of those classes. So some of the classes of calculating benefits and so on are taking place at the union's building, and this is kind of the central area where you see one of the director, Dona Zenilda, kind of teaching the basics of how to add up your benefits. In the context of the COVID-19, as a result of the abrupt and brutal onset of the pandemic, two sudden crises emerged: a public health crisis and an economic crisis. As a result of that, domestic workers are directly affected. In Brazil, we commonly say that the first person to have died officially of the COVID-19 was a domestic worker who caught the COVID from her employer. Okay, and there's a whole story also about how employers very often, for a long time, were actually not declaring themselves as sick for various reasons, but among other things, they wanted their domestic worker to keep on coming. So as a result of that, several thousands of people die of COVID in the first few months only. In total, Brazil now has calculated at least 706,000 people who died as the COVID, which is the second largest tally outside of the United States, and it's the greatest in proportion. It's about 2% of the population, whereas in the United States, it's about 1%. Domestic workers, as I said, are directly impacted to their jobs. Oftentimes, as was mentioned in the round table, they're offered. I think it was mentioned, Marique. They are offered an impossible choice. You abandon your family and you stay with the employer for as long as the crisis lasts, or you go back home and you don't have an income anymore. And then how do you survive? Right. The formal unemployment in Brazil is going to explode, and GDP contracts by 4%. So job losses for domestic workers only in the first few months, we figured that there's about 1.9 million domestic workers who are going to lose their jobs, about 30% of all the workers in this category. Congruently, the poverty rate is going to reach its highest level in decades. Those who remain employed are employed in very dangerous health conditions, okay? And their labor rights rapidly disintegrate. We see an average cut of about 35% in domestic workers' salaries. They were already low. They're going to get cut even more. And there's a sharp increase in violence in the workplace. Psychological, physical, financial violence. We see instances, and I'll get back to that in a minute, instances of slave labor that are reported routinely in the first few months. And sexual assaults rise radically as well. And how does the state react? I got that quote from the Estado de Minas because that's exactly how Bolsonaro will react. Denialism and minimizing of the COVID's public health and economic effects. Essentially, the federal government will refuse to take charge. And the quote essentially embodies what Bolsonaro says. It says, "So what? I'm sorry. What do you want me to do? My name is Messias because it's true. His middle name is Messiah, but I don't do miracles, meaning I can't really help you out. Okay, so this is your president in the context of crisis. And so what the priority is going to be there is going to be prioritizing the economy over the citizens' health and welfare, right? And the rallying cry of the federal government was reopen for business, don't close. Okay, don't close down the businesses, don't close down the places of employment. Eventually, there's an emergency support program that's going to be enacted, Auxilio Emergencial, but it's actually enacted by the federal Congress. The Bolsonaro government did not want such a program originally, but when it's clear that the public is receiving it extremely well, the Bolsonaro government is going to then take credit for it. But that emergency program was not particularly generous. It was about 600 reais for the first few months of the crisis, cut down to about 200 reais, divide by 4 roughly for Canadian dollars, right? And it ends by April 2021, whereas the crisis continues on. Something also very distressing is less than half of the people who applied received help from that program, okay? This is due, among other things, to bureaucratic complications, the online nature of the application form. So you had to apply online, and the app wasn't functioning very well. You needed a computer, and a lot of people did not have access to a computer who needed this emergency help, right? And so, and there's slowness in the distribution of support payments. So hunger and destitution rise radically. Okay. How does the Sindicato react in this case? Well, at first it'll continue its advocacy engagements in response to the crisis. And we mentioned that, or it was mentioned during the roundtable, the union is going to participate in a national effort, national campaign, which was also present in other Latin American countries, general name of which was Take Care of Those Who Take Care of You. And the focus was in particular on employers to take responsibility to support their domestic workers during the time of crisis. And there was a focus on the state as well to not declare domestic workers as essential workers, because that meant that they had to come into work. They lost a great number of protections, et cetera, et cetera. There's also face-to-face and online presence to continue informing domestic workers, but essentially, very quickly, it becomes clear to the diretoras, the directors of the sindicato, that domestic workers' priorities have changed because of the public and public health and economic crises that are raging. There's a marked increase, as I said, in destitution, but also in workplace violence, and that are compounded by the state's ineffectiveness or unwillingness to provide assistance. The result, what the union will see, is a tremendous and unprecedented increase in demands for services and solidarity, right? What the person holding the plate here, what it says on the plate is it says hunger, okay? And she's got empty pots and pans. And so for domestic workers, the priorities seem to have shifted more on surviving the crisis and less on claiming labor rights. And in fact, I'll show you a few quotes taken directly from the union and union directors in just a second, but one of them said, "Well, they can't care about rights right now. They just need to survive." Okay, that's simply what one of the directors said. So this moment of great distress represents a critical juncture for the union because it can either continue to focus on advocacy and try to power through, or it can try to transform its organization and its resistance strategy to adapt, which is a very tall challenge, right? And so these are some of the quotes that I took from my meetings with the leaders of the union, basically saying, without a doubt, this is the worst moment in Brazil's contemporary history right now. I've never seen this situation being so bad in 30 years working for the union. Another one of the directors, the president at the time of the union, said, every day we receive domestic workers who have been subjected to psychological and physical violence, forced workplace seclusion, slave labor, and rape. Another quote, many domestic workers don't have enough money to pay for food or rent because they were fired. They feel like they have nowhere to turn for support. They think state assistance is too difficult to access. And they include that in there, but they were saying also, many of these workers have to choose between paying the rent and eating. And many of them chooses paying the rent because the biggest single thing that they don't want to see is become homeless with their families. Okay, and they say we've never seen that in this country. That's their quote. Domestic workers not being able to eat and feed their families. That was unimaginable in this country, and now we're faced with this reality. So what do? Well, the union elected to adapt to this changing structure of needs and demands. The directors expanded and they diversified the union's repertoire of resistance strategies in a context where the state was proving ineffective in providing assistance to domestic workers during the crisis, right? So in this new approach, or part of this new approach, they'll emphasize care and service provision in addition to continuing with their advocacy mission. So as part of this new kind of these new tools that they'll have in their toolbox, they will take an active part in the distribution of food baskets and hygiene kits for all domestic workers, not solely the domestic workers linked with the union. And they will also set up clinics. This was part of a broader national effort. I think that was something that was also present in other Latin American countries, to clinics to help domestic workers navigate the complicated application process of emergency support payments, but also how to access other sources of help. But perhaps more importantly, what the union's directors decided to do was to engage in sustained, informal, everyday practices of psychological support for affiliated and non-affiliated domestic workers. So as precarity and workplace and living space violence rose markedly during the public health and economic crisis, the directors of the union observed that anxiety and stress increased accordingly. And both among, of course, unemployed domestic workers, but also among those who continued to labor. Among other things, this change was clearly perceptible through the intensified and multifaceted demand for psychological support, specifically that the union received from these workers that went to see them. And again, this occurred in a context of vacuum of accessible support and services, whether offered by the state or from private sources. So the union's directors found that the domestic workers with whom they were in contact appeared increasingly desperate to open up about the challenges that they were facing and the violence that they were living on a day-to-day basis. They wanted to speak to someone who would be willing to hear them out and whom they could trust. And this was important, whom they could trust because of their common background. And here this is of great significance. One of the reasons for which this system works is because the diretoras, the directors, the activists of the unions were themselves domestic workers. They had gone themselves through periods of crisis. They had done the work. They had gone through the heartache, and they felt that domestic workers who went to see them felt that they could be understood organically, if you will. To give you an idea, as a result of this, the union directors would see sometimes 20 and more domestic workers every day for months who would come in to talk about their work situation, but mostly who would come in for psychological support. Okay, and so and here this is the entrance to the union. As you open up the front door, this is what you see. So this is the door person's desk. In the back is the kitchen and a kind of large meeting room. And this is one of the smaller rooms. And what the union does is they provided all really domestic workers with a safe space. So that these women, mostly domestic workers, were women who came during that time, but also the few male domestic workers, so that they could come in and speak freely to compassionate union officers who would provide them with support whenever possible and appropriate. Sometimes situations were so extreme that union directors didn't really know what to say other than just be there and listen. And in fact, that proved to have been a great help in sometimes, right? So that's the safe space offered by the union allowed domestic workers to open up to empathetic union directors about the difficulties that they faced, including in non-work related abuses, because of course during that time period, what we see is a tremendous increase in instances of domestic violence as well. So among the topics that are broached during these conversations between the directors of the union and domestic workers, there will be the challenges of paying for food and for rent, labor violations and other workplace abuses, domestic violence, feelings of isolation, and feelings of helplessness. So these discussions and sharing of emotions reportedly, so according to what the directors saw and the feedback that they've gotten and later on we've received, provided domestic workers who went to the union with welcome release from the tremendous everyday pressure that they were facing. Let's keep in mind that in a lot of cases, domestic workers were often the sole providers of their households in terms of income, right, during the crisis. And they felt that they were obligated to provide no matter what the cost and no matter what the consequences. Okay, so imagine yourself in that context, the psychological weight that represented. And so according to the feedback that we received, that they received the union, these conversations reportedly provided a measure of comfort to domestic workers, many of whom said that talking about their problems helped to take a weight off their shoulders. And what's interesting is that this correlates really well with the counseling and psychology counseling literature on what's called affect labeling, right? Which essentially says that putting feelings into words, well, that literature shows that talking about feelings and eventually writing about your feelings can help significantly people regulate emotions and deal with difficult personal situations. And so even though that literature never really dealt with the situation that we're talking about today, what we saw at the union, what took place correlates really well with that literature. So it's no surprise that these practices of care provision were reportedly very appreciated by domestic workers, who often said that they had no one else to talk to. They felt that they could talk to, that they could discuss their difficulties and fears with, so that they felt that they could talk with the directors, the women of the union, but nobody else really. And they said that came very often. They said talking helps. And as such, it appears that the union played a significant and central role in the lives of many São Paulo domestic workers and their families during the COVID crisis. And not coincidentally, we figured out very quickly that the membership of the union increased significantly during and after the crisis. So not only during, where this support was being provided, as well as other types of care and provision support, but also afterwards. Right? So membership continued to increase. This can be interpreted as a form of recognition on the part of domestic workers of the value of the Sindicato's diversified efforts. And we can see it also as a reflection of how, and this is also how the union kind of, the union directors kind of pictured or depicted their effort. It was an effort to stay relevant to the domestic workers' needs and demands and interests. And they continued their advocacy during that time. So I've already taken too much time. I think I'm a little bit over time. Closing thoughts. So basically, it seems that in the face of this sudden crisis, in a context where the state was proving ineffective or unwilling to help domestic workers and marginalized populations, and a context in which domestic workers' demands changed, the union, the STD-MSP, adapted and broadened its resistance strategies. It therefore successfully hybridized, okay? It changed its organization to offer care and service provision in addition to advocacy activities. these actions by the STD-MSP were deemed essential by many domestic workers for their survival and that of their family during the crisis. And what's interesting also is that, contrary to the literature's expectation, the union did not disintegrate and it didn't collapse as a result of reorganizing its activities. However, this had a cost. Okay, this had a cost. It had a cost for activists. Several of the directors, the diretoras, suffered from exhaustion, psychological distress, stress, and anxiety after months of providing this support. They knew and they still know how to listen well. They were very empathetic. They were present, but they had no training in psychological support or counseling, which meant that every day at the end of the day, they were taking all these emotions with them back home every day. This proved very challenging for several of them after a while. And in fact, this is part of an ongoing project that we have. We're working together to secure support for the union activists, the directors right now, on the part of psychologists who are active in the community in Sao Paulo, as well as to establish a system of psychological resources, if you will, for domestic workers in Sao Paulo as well. And how does the story end? Because the union could have chosen to go back to its advocacy activities. Well, it did not. It continues to this day with the hybrid model, offering advocacy and mobilization engagement. And this is going to be on this last slide here, where they're active. This was just a few weeks ago, where they were protesting a blacklist of nannies that had been set up in some of the nice neighborhoods of, quote unquote, of Sao Paulo. Blacklist of nannies because these nannies were reportedly standing up for their labor rights. And so therefore, employers in those nice neighborhoods drafted a list of the nannies that shouldn't be contracted, that shouldn't be work contract shouldn't be given. So the union went out and protested, and that received tremendous media coverage. So that was a really that was a significant victory for them. So they continue with their advocacy, but they also continue with the care and service provision. I wonder if I kept I hope I kept the picture. No, I didn't. But they're involved in providing a variety of services and care, in particular dental care. They have services for, they will have a hairdressers that will come by the union's offices periodically, eye exams, and several of these services provided to domestic workers through the support of various community partners. But the union decided to remain with this mission as being a hybrid mission that would be at the core of its activities. That is all for my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention, and of course, any questions or comments that you may have, I'd be happy to take at this point. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much for sharing this story and for contributing to our workshop on this topic. So, are there questions? Yeah, Brandon.
Oh, it's okay. Thanks for the great presentation. It was super interesting. I have a ton of questions, but I'm going to limit mine maybe to one towards the end. The implications of or the sort of your final thoughts. One of the questions I had was whether there was disagreement in the organization not to return to advocacy. And I'm thinking here about conversations I would often hear in my own field site, where the union that I worked with, they were a big established union, but the big way in which they built member support was precisely by providing services at a scale that was higher, but essentially you could imagine them getting to that point. Like, they provided healthcare services, they worked with development, with a Mexican Development Foundation to do all kinds of vaccines and healthcare, childcare, all kind. They expanded out. But one of the criticisms would be, but they actually have been less good at like politicizing the tourism sector.
Yeah.
And so actually the advocacy side, the militancy side goes away. And what you have essentially is like a business union with a lot of social services to it.
Yeah.
Or rather, I could imagine advocates in the organization might even have this criticism because I've heard it in other in my own context. And so
Yeah.
I'm curious if that decision not to return to advocacy, but to incorporate services produce some kind of strategic disagreement. Obviously, time will tell whether this works out one way or the other, but I'm curious if that created a debate that had to be kind of talked about and resolved.
Yeah, that's a great question. We'll answer as we go, right? That's probably best. Okay. So, and in fact, that was interesting because I talked to my friends and partners at the union about this, and I talked to them about this, about the literature, and I said, what you're doing is, it's fairly unique, and so on. They're pretty surprised, and they said, why? And so I explained a little bit, and they said, well, you see, this is very bizarre to us because the way we were originally created was we were not a union at first, we were an association. And before that, we were a very informal association. And what we did was provide some sort of care and supportive services to each other. That's how we got started. And then eventually that got formalized into an association and then eventually into a union. And the union creation was 30 years ago. And so, of course, what's interesting is that in the narrative of the union, I would argue probably little remains of that original kind of association, networking, creation. Most of the discourse of the union up until the crisis had shifted to militancy, advocacy, grassroots organization, organização da base, et cetera. And there was a lot less on that, what had happened at the time. But for a lot of the directors, at the time of the crisis, kind of going to more of a hybrid system, incorporating care provision, was natural. That was something that was part of the DNA, if you will, of the union. And again, this is interesting because there is a significant time lapse between the moment where the association very loosely emerges and then it gets formalized, then it gets turned into a union, then the crisis hits 30 years later. But there was people remembered. There was an institutional memory of how the union was created and what originally it was about. And so it was felt that it was kind of a natural reaction for the union to kind of go back a little bit to its roots in that respect. But also, I think that when the crisis hit, the directors were pretty unanimous that providing care was the thing to do, being there, providing psychological support was the thing to do. And they saw, as I said in the presentation, they saw that it was being there the right time and responding to demands. And so for them, again, this was kind of a bit of a natural transition. But the way the union acts now and behaves is they reinvested their mission of militancy. They're still very dynamic, and I will say just a little something to put on your radar screen is, among other things, that is because of the greater broader national context. Because among other things, of the return to power of Lula, of a kind of center-left leftist government, which has provided a broader political context that's much more conducive to the promotion of demands of that sort. But the union continues with this mission of advocacy. This is a very, very clear one, very strong one still. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Thank you for the excellent presentation. I have a few questions.
Of course.
You mentioned that even before the COVID-19 crisis, the number of domestic workers or household workers, or however term I use domestic workers because that's the term you used in your presentation. The number of domestic workers was very high. It was in the hundreds, or I think you mentioned like there were at least like 800 that they were in touch like every day, and it was like 2,000, and at the same time, so the number of unionized workers is very high, while in general the number of unionized workers, like in the country at large,
the
is very
country.
low. So I wondered
Yeah.
if you could tell us a little bit more of what are the strategies that they implement to be so successful with unionization in a context where there isn't much unionization of domestic workers happening. So that's one question. And then I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your participatory action research methodology. And you mentioned that some of your interlocutors are conducting interviews and doing the research itself. So I wonder whether, how did that happen? Like whether there was some sort of like, I don't know, like training that you gave them on how to do ethnographic interviews or things like that. And then the other thing you mentioned, was it 15% of women in the workforce who work as domestic workers in Brazil?
Afro-Brazilian.
Afro
Yeah.
15% of Afro
15.
of
Yeah.
Afro-Brazilian women. What
Women.
about like women in general? Like, do you know like the
Yeah, the
percentage?
numbers are lower. I calculated a percentage at some point. Let's see if I have it here. I don't. I have it for Afro-Brazilian. It's somewhere around. We know that it's the largest sector of employment for women in Brazil in general. I would say probably somewhere around. I don't know. I would say probably around 10, 12.
Okay.
Yeah. It's higher among Afro descendants, but I actually stupidly didn't write down the number in general.
Yeah.
So we work it, but the problem with those numbers also when we end up working with these is that we're, as I mentioned earlier, with regards to the live-in, is that we're working with statistics that are very often outdated from the moment that they're published, right? And that's not specific to Brazil. I think that's
Right.
for a lot of countries.
Yeah.
So that's the numbers that we're working with, but they are imprecise. Yeah.
Right. And finally, like one last thing, you mentioned, and this is something that we've seen in so many contexts, that the rate of violence in the workplace increased.
Yeah.
And you mentioned like the particularly gender-based violence, like a lot of sexual violence against domestic workers. So what are your thoughts about, like, why do you think this happened? Like that there is like such a rampant increase in violence in the workplace against this particular group of workers.
Okay.
So maybe we could just take the group.
Okay, sure.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Mansi from University of Copenhagen. Thanks a lot for your presentation. I have kind of a two-part question and I'll keep it very brief. The first is to maybe understand a little bit the financial model of the union and how that may have transitioned pre and post pandemic. Particularly, you said that there was an effort to distribute food or hygiene kits, and
Okay. Yeah.
how were the funds arranged for that, or what kind of philanthropic
Yes.
activity you observed? And the second is a bit broader in terms of, I really appreciate your kind of in-depth participatory work with the union and kind of highlighting their successes, but also the costs, as you mentioned, on the labor that activism kind of demands of some of these workers.
Yeah.
And I think my question is, to what extent do you and to what extent do some of these workers see this work as justified, of them having to carry the burden of a lot of the care services as well as kind of regulatory work that should be performed by the state? And I completely understand the context of the withdrawal, but what is the cost of them having to do it at this kind of intensive way?
Yeah.
I'm asking that particularly because in the context that I work, a lot of the domestic workers that were part of the union kind of completely stepped back from the union after the pandemic because of the burden.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm sorry to give you all these questions.
That's great.
Mine, actually, I don't know how to put it into a question, but it actually relates exactly to what Mansi was saying. And it's an observation because in Bogota, we now have a public policy which is very progressive, bringing services to marginalized populations, etc. But it works, I would say, almost 100% because the employees of the state who coordinate these centers are completely overworked, exploited. They have limited contracts, etc. They have to be available on the weekends, etc. And because of their compromiso, how do you say that? Their dedication, that's why it works. And so it always seems that somebody does get exploited, or in this case, I mean, they're volunteers and they do it for the good of it. But so where does that element come into all our discussions that we had this morning and here too? Thank you.
Thank you. Shall I? Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for the great questions and feedback. Maria Alice, your first question, I believe, was about kind of unionization patterns in Brazil. So I guess my answer to that part of the question is going to be, I'm not sure I can give you a good answer because I'm not familiar with the way in which all the main unions in Brazil function as concerns mobilizing. What you see is that what we can figure out is that in particular since 2017, several domestic workers unions ended up becoming empty shells because the funding was cut out from the state because of the end of the union tax, as it was called. So those that are left were typically those that were, of course, the more resilient, the more dynamic ones, but also where you had oftentimes it's retired domestic workers who will give their time, who will take the leadership and kind of be part of the directorship. But I can speak certainly to the way in which that union functions in Sao Paulo, and for them the success of their recruitment strategy is their, in my opinion, is their outreach strategy. What I talked about, the fact that they are present specifically in the communities, in the favelas, that they go where people live and tell them, as I said, you know, first of all, you do have rights. This is how they function, et cetera, et cetera. And they do that constantly. They did that before the pandemic. I started working with them in 2017. That's kind of roughly where they had started. And they keep up with their members through WhatsApp. And again, I think related to the demands that this may have on the union directors, this is very significant. But they keep in touch and they organize constantly activities. And what they started doing, and I was really lucky to participate in that effort, was doing outreach efforts, going to now not only different, it could be community centers or you know, people's homes, but also in sometimes a little bit of a bigger community center, so that the union could bring with it services. So they started doing that about a year ago. So they would go in with not only their message, but also with kind of some sort of service provision. And that's been clearly very popular. But for Sao Paulo, what's helped also tremendously is the collective agreement. They won the right to the collective agreement, and that's their visiting card. Right? It says domestic workers know about that, and it's made a significant difference in their day-to-day lives. So I would say that's probably kind of this part of the secret to their success. The participatory research action method. So this has been a lot of fun. The work that we've done, it has been lately, they called it, so they said, okay, the research is going to be called Domésticas pesquisando domésticas. So domestic workers researching domestic workers, because that's what it was. That's what the goal was, for the union to have a snapshot, a picture of who were domestic workers in Sao Paulo. Literally, when we sat down and we kind of imagined it, the leadership said, we want to know about their challenges, that their fights, but we want to know about their hopes and their dreams too. So we have parts of the questionnaires that are about that, right? And who went out to do the research was, indeed, they were about a group of about 15 domestic workers. And yes, I gave them training. We had awesome sessions where, you know, we can come in with the coffee and then we talk about different situations. And it was amazing because, you know, here I am talking about kind of, you know, interview strategies and things of the sort, but they knew the field far better than I ever could, right? And so there were a whole lot of things that I didn't have to explain, and then there were other things that sometimes were a little bit more challenging, which is what do you do with the data, what do you do with the answers, and things of the sort. So but it was really so much fun. And they did it while the pandemic was still ongoing. They did it because they said if we don't get this snapshot now, even in a context of crisis, especially in a context of crisis, we need to know who the domestic workers are. So this worked really well. And now they've, at first, so we got funding together for this project. And then later on, they went and they got funding by themselves for the second leg of the project. So I wasn't even part of the proposal. So this was awesome. And now they have enough resources that we had 300 participants in the first round. Now we're shooting for 1,100. I said 1,000 earlier. They want 1,100, so which is amazing. Except when it comes time to crunching the data, so that's a little bit more difficult. But that's a super nice challenge to have. So that's how we work. But literally, it was repeated conversations that we had about what is it that the directors wanted, what questions did they want to ask, and I had, I provided some questions, and I said, is this what you want? I said, yeah, okay, but what about this? So then we redesigned other questions, we tested them, does this make sense to you all as you're, et cetera, and they were super enthusiastic, and they insisted on doing the work, as I said, even during the pandemic. So it was it was really a lot of fun. And your last question was about the violence, the kind of the gender-based violence that happened during the pandemic in the domestic workplace in particular. I don't, I'm not going to offer an interpretation necessarily. I'm going to tell you what the union directors think, to start up with. And what they said was that, well, very simply, a lot of the time, the partner is at home, the partner lost his job, and the partner is in a situation where he feels he's lost control. And the only control that he can have is over his spouse. And he exercises that control to an extreme, right? And that leads to situations of violence, right? And that starts in the household, and then that's carried over to the domestic workplace, where the employer is going to kind of reproduce this pattern of violence versus the domestic worker, who's very vulnerable. And we had reports of violence that were perpetrated by, in fact, not only the male employers, but very often the female employer, because who's at the nexus, the articulation of, is very often the patrona, which is the woman of the household, right? Which is not atypical, but lots of reports of verbal and physical abuse also during that time. Yeah. So, Marcy, you wanted to know about the financial model in particular of, so basically what was behind this ability to distribute food and hygiene kind of baskets and provisions. So it was a twofold model. There were private donations in Brazil. So many employers will contribute to funds that were started in, among other things, by this National Federation of Domestic Workers, which is called FENATRAD, National Federation of Domestic Workers, and they set up funds. There were other organizations that collaborated. There were also international donors, among which the International Federation of Domestic Workers, and a variety of international NGOs that help. And they provided the most of the funding that allowed for the purchasing of the food baskets. And then companies in Brazil, private companies that were producing hygiene products, also chipped in and donated. And that's kind of how the money and the resources came together. Then later on, the domestic workers unions leaders had to assemble a lot of these baskets and then deliver them. I had great pictures of that, but I mean, there's only so much you can show in a PowerPoint without losing the audience. But so you know, great moments where they come in and they help out to kind of sort out the products and distribute them, and you know, the difference that makes was tremendous. So that's where these resources came from, and the costs of providing support, the costs on the directors. It was a very significant cost. There's some things that I can't really talk about, that I'm not going to talk about, but there's some very significant costs in there. I would say that probably something that helped was that it was a conscious decision that they had made originally to become involved in this effort. The directors knew what they were doing, and it was pretty amazing because when I talked to them about it during and after, because we were in touch. We were in touch during the pandemic, even though we couldn't travel out of Canada. Although Brazil would have accepted us, we couldn't leave Canada, but we were in touch with WhatsApp and different, and they had developed this distanciation also at some point, like things that you know, counselors are taught, that you have to at some point kind of establish a bit of distance between the emotions that the person is giving you and what you can process and bring with you. They had started developing that, but that's after, as I said, you know, sleepless nights and exhaustion and so on. But I think that initial decision helped a lot, that they had agreed that they were going to participate. They had agreed that they were going to do it. They probably didn't fully realize the implications of doing something like that, or the kind of the intensity of the needs. But once they got involved in it, for most of them, they did not relent, which is remarkable. Yeah, thank you. And Maria, the question of I guess broader question of kind of the manner in which union leaders, I guess, kind of give their time, and this is a tremendously important question and challenge when you know, there's a context in which national governments are not supportive, national laws may be full of holes, unionization is difficult, but even forget that, you're in a context of, again, recuperating from a context of economic public health crisis, and being a union member or director very often supposes giving up your time, right? You volunteer. And so therefore there's a cost, there's a significant cost in financial cost, time cost, et cetera, et cetera. I see it, this union, because they work 5 days a week, and then they have the outreach efforts during the weekends, on Sundays, right? And sometimes they work all the time. But the amazing thing that they have, this amazing resilience, is embodied in this saying that the outgoing president now, because again, they have elections periodically. Their statutes are very clear. You cannot have the same president of the union for more than 2 consecutive terms. They have to leave, and they can still serve on the board, but they have to leave as president, etc. But the president who's leaving at the end of her term, Donna Silvia here, will always say, you know, it's life is work. It's about work, and we're here to make a difference, and we're gonna do it. And every time we come up with these ideas for new things to do, you know, we stop, and there's this brief pause, and we look at each other, and she would go, well, that's going to be work, but that's going to be worth it, right? And I think that embodies it well, which is this dedication. But I think we saw during the COVID, during the pandemic, perhaps the limits of that logic of giving and dedication and selflessness. At some point there, there may be a point that's reached, that's a brick wall up to a certain extent. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Are there other questions? I have one about why psychological services. And so the pandemic seemed to kind of create, you know, a real focus on mental health. And I just wonder, so it seems that they're participating in a sort of global sort of focus on that. Um, and yet sometimes I think, and so I respect that, I know that this is one of the inequalities of life of who gets access to mental health services.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, I wonder, is this about coping with an intolerable situation, right? Of
Yeah.
violence and domestic violence and these and starvation. And so I just wondered where did the idea come from? What was, was there other kinds of movements towards psychological counseling? Was it just that this is what members were asking for from them, that they were coming in and telling their stories, and then so that in a way this is about the responsiveness of the union to their members, or kind of where did this idea arise from, and was it
Yeah.
so unusual within this context to have a focus on it?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a couple of possible ways that can be answered. I'm sure there's much more than that, in fact. But the one of the individual starting points is that some of the women on the directorship, on the leaders of the union, some of them had in the past been involved in therapy. They had done some bit of therapy here and there, and they had found it very useful. They had found it tremendously useful. And so when the crisis starts and they start seeing this, they begin to see this inflow of workers who sit down, and domestic workers would ask, they would say, so do you know, I'm facing this situation right now, and I just don't know who to talk to. And then, can you recommend something? And they couldn't at the union. They couldn't, because there was nothing that they could recommend. They weren't aware of any resources, and those that existed weren't really functioning very well, et cetera, et cetera. But let's talk a little bit. That's what they would say. Let's talk about this. Let's take some time and let's talk. And then very quickly they realized the impact that had, the positive impact, and then they started talking about it as talking and sharing. Talking and sharing, talking and sharing. And then they were telling me about this, and I said, well, you're really, what you're doing here is that you're providing them psychological support and backing. They say, yeah, that's what we're doing, but we're talking and sharing, and that they have nobody else that they can talk to, that they feel they can talk to. So the origin of this is multiple. Yes, there was a kind of personal, there's a trajectory here. There's also a clear origin in demand, and the changing in the structure of demands on the part of the membership, domestic workers, affiliated or not, that would come into the union's office. The demand would shift as of the beginning of the crisis tremendously away from registration, collective questions regarding the collective agreement. Can you call my employer on my behalf because there's a problem at work, but I don't really know how to face them, but it was mostly that, to, I don't want to talk about workers' rights, because if I talk about workers' rights with my employer, they're going to fire me and I can't. But the situation is terrible, and I would love to talk to somebody about it, and I can talk to my partner at home. I can't talk to my children about it. I don't want to scare them off. My friends are in similar. I don't know what to do. And at the union, they decided, okay, well, let's do something about it. And there's this tilting point where very quickly they realize, we can keep on talking about rights and about labor rights, but really right now, that's not going to do much good if we do just that. So let's do what we're already de facto doing anyway, and let's kind of make sure that we do it right, and that we're on the same page about it. And then they go on. That's what they do. And I think Brenna's question was very good, because let's not forget that they never lose sight of their advocacy mission, but they will incorporate the care provision there, and that's probably the root of it. But it's multiple. Yes, multiple origins. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much for this really, anyway, insightful and anyway, thinking about can organizations transform, and maybe what does it take for them to do so. So I want to need my hands.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So there is a reception out there. Feel free to go out and have dinner. That is what it is, and particularly for those of us visiting from afar, that this is dinner for tonight. So
Thank you.
enjoy it, and it also hopefully, as food does, hopefully will fuel a few more conversations, and the questions that were lurking in the back of your mind and didn't quite get articulated, maybe over a little tidbit of food, it will. Something will come and further conversation will happen about this, about our common interests.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Al.